Good evening. I'm Penny McPhee, president of the Arthur M. Blank Family Foundation. Thank you for joining us for our first speaker series event of 2012. And welcome to those of you who are participating in our live webcast. We encourage viewers to join the conversation on Twitter using hashtag B2 B25. Special thanks also to Carol Emig, president of Child Trends, a national nonprofit research firm dedicated to improving outcomes for children. Carol and Child Trends are leading the Twitter conversation on tonight's program. Our event tonight is part of a national campaign led by the Birth to Five Policy Alliance, designed to raise awareness about the benefits of early childhood policies and investments. For us, the compelling story you'll hear tonight from Dr. Jack Shonkoff is an affirmation that Georgia's future is resting on how we invest in our youngest children. In our hearts, we know this is right. When we look into a child's eyes, our hearts tell us that this is where we should put our time, our talent, and our financial resources. Our balance sheets tell us the same thing. Jim Heckman, a Nobel Prize-winning economist, confirms that investing in Birth to Five is the surest way to maximize return on investment. Now, thanks to Dr. Shonkoff, we have breakthrough scientific research that affirms what we know in our hearts and what we know from our financial statements. What happens to children from birth to five is tough to overcome and unlikely to be undone. What happens to children from birth to five shapes the rest of their lives. As our moderator, Stephanie Blank, often says, there are no do-overs in raising children. So if we follow our hearts, if we live by our balance sheets, or if we stick to the science, we come to the same place. The future really does depend on how we invest in our youngest citizens. Jack Shonkoff's impressive bio is in your program. This January, New York Times columnist Nick Kristof drew widespread attention to his groundbreaking research on toxic stress in children. I'm sure many of you saw that article. Dr. Shonkoff was quoted as saying there's such a thing as a biology of social class disparities. Apparently, the gap between the 1% and the 99%, or at least between the 15% living below the poverty line and everyone else, is built into the brain. The Blank Foundation is critically concerned about those disparities in our society, and our goal is to help identify and support creative solutions to those social problems. We know that understanding the problem is the first step in seeking solutions. So I hope you'll join me in welcoming Jack Shonkoff to our stage. Jack, please come. Well, actually, you're gonna come here. At the conclusion of Dr. Shonkoff's remarks, Stephanie Blank will moderate a question and answer. Stephanie is the founding chair of GEARS, Georgia Early Education Alliance for Ready Students. So we will look forward to hearing first from Dr. Shonkoff and then from all of you. Thank you for being here.
I'm not going to use this. Thank you very much, Penny. I really appreciate that introduction, and thank you to the Arthur M. Blank Family Foundation for this wonderful honor to be here, and to all of you attending. So let me tell you a little bit what I'm going to do tonight in my formal remarks, and then we'll open it up to discussion, is to give you a little bit of a sense of how we're thinking about this scientific revolution on the biological side, in terms of not only how it strengthens the case for why investing in young children is so important, but also how we can use this science to take the field to another place and to increase the impact that we have, particularly on the lives of children who are the most vulnerable. So this is really mobilizing science to strengthen the way in which we can make a difference. And I just want to start by kind of teeing up the larger issue, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about this because everybody in this audience could say what I'm about to say. So we know how much healthy development is a foundation for so many things, not just for readiness to succeed in school, but the foundation for what will ultimately make for a more economically productive and healthy society, that will be the foundation for responsible and engaged citizenship, healthy communities, and also the ability to effectively parent the next generation. And a lot of this falls under the category of my grandmother could have told you that. And I will tell you that the most powerful science that we have right now from a policy perspective is science that agrees with what your grandmother could have told you, so that it's not a hard sell in terms of the implications, but what it does mean is it gives us some new ideas about what we might do with our investments. So what we do know is that we're living in the midst of a revolution in molecular biology and neuroscience and genomics, along with all of the behavioral and social sciences, which have been the foundation for almost half a century now of our understanding of early childhood. But the biological sciences now have taken things to another level. And not only can they be used to help people understand the importance of the early childhood years, but as I'm going to hopefully share a little bit with you this evening, to catalyze some new thinking about how we can be more effective. So I want to start by making the case first that there is really just one science for all of these different fields. Right now, we have complained for decades about the silos, the fragmentation among health and education and economic development and human services. We could add to this the child welfare system. You could add community development, housing. We always talk about how each of these fields is too siloed. And in fact, they are, in that they each have their own kind of scientific basis or their own professional wisdom. They don't have meetings together. They don't read the same journals. But we understand that that's a problem. So we work hard at trying to build bridges among them, and we encourage interagency agreements, and we ask people to integrate their data systems. But somehow it doesn't do the trick, and the reason for that is because we haven't really been using a scientific door to get into this. We've been asking people who live in different worlds to work together, based on what your grandmother could have told you, which is that a lot of you are all serving the same children in the same families. Why are you doing it so separately? Well, what I'm going to kind of share with you this evening is how basically all of these fields are now fed by a single science. There is not a science for early childhood learning and a science for early childhood health and a science for trauma and a science for childcare and a science for the healthcare system. There really is a single science. And if we would use this science as our door of entry, rather than come in through 5 different doors and find ourselves in the middle somewhere, we could actually drive much more productive investments, and we could increase the return on all of those investments. And so I'm going to spend the rest of this session walking you through what this integrated science is all about. I'm going to start with one of 2 very brief videos. This is, as I had shared with some people earlier in the day, this video, which runs about 1 minute and 20 or 30 seconds, took us between 2 and 3 years to produce. Now, for those of you who are in that business, you kind of understand, but some of you may even say, why did it take you 2 to 3 years? Because it really is just 1 minute and 20 seconds. But the reason it did is not because of the techniques of putting the film together, although that was a little bit of a challenge. But we subjected this to a more rigorous scientific peer review than most of the journal articles that scientists get produced. And so we did not decide this was finished until all of the scientists we work with said, that's right. That's an exactly accurate representation of what the science is. So included some things where earlier versions, a neuroscientist said, this is nice, but that neuron is upside down. Not that anybody else would really care, but what it does is it allows me to comfortably, and I do have to make one disclaimer. I'm not a neuroscientist, and I'm not a psychologist. I'm a pediatrician who, like any good pediatrician, wants to bring all that science together in the service of children's well-being. So I'm kind of the integrator, not the scientist. This is your crash course in neuroscience and the biology of the development of the brain. It has all the key principles in it, so we'll roll it.
A child's experiences during the earliest years of life have a lasting impact on the architecture of the developing brain. Genes provide the basic blueprint, but experiences shape the process that determines whether a child's brain will provide a strong or weak foundation for all future learning, behavior, and health. During this important period of brain development, billions of brain cells called neurons send electrical signals to communicate with each other. These connections form circuits that become the basic foundation of brain architecture. Circuits and connections proliferate at a rapid pace and are reinforced through repeated use. Our experiences and environment dictate which circuits and connections get more use. Connections that are used more grow stronger and more permanent. Meanwhile, connections that are used less fade away through a normal process called pruning. Well-used circuits create lightning-fast pathways for neural signals to travel across regions of the brain. Simple circuits form first, providing a foundation for more complex circuits to build on later. Through this process, neurons form strong circuits and connections for emotions, motor skills, behavioral control, logic, language, and memory during the early critical period of development. With repeated use, these circuits become more efficient and connect to other areas of the brain more rapidly. While they originate in specific areas of the brain, the circuits are interconnected. You can't have one type of skill without the others to support it. Like building a house, everything is connected, and what comes first forms a foundation for all that comes later.
So that's your crash course in normal brain development. Just to highlight a few of the key principles. The brain development actually begins before birth, but at the time of birth, the baby has most of the brain cells, most of the neurons, but very few of the connections. And those connections, which start out as something called the synapse, look at a baby. Next time you have a chance to look at a baby, know that every second, 700 new synapses are being made in that baby's brain. Literally, 700 synapses every second. If that sounds like a lot, remember the brain has billions and billions of cells and trillions of circuits, so it has to make them quickly. And when these circuits get developed is genetically on a genetic timetable, but how the circuits get built is literally influenced and shaped by the kinds of experiences the child has. And if the experiences are positive, they build positive circuits. And if they're negative, they can disrupt the circuitry, as you'll see in a couple of minutes. It's built in a bottom-up fashion, and everything from sitting and crawling to walking to cooing to babbling to saying words to talking to reading to writing to arguing to making love and to kind of writing great novels and to twittering away and tweeting, all of that is ultimately subsumed by brain circuitry. Now, the problem is that the brain doesn't retain maximum plasticity and adaptability, okay? When the brain just begins to develop its circuits, and it's all that kind of circuitry to be, it's optimally what the neuroscientists call plastic. Neuroplasticity means adaptability, flexibility. It can move around and adapt to different things. Because remember, a newborn baby has the capacity to speak every language that's ever been spoken in the world, adapt to a variety of cultures, a variety of environments, and in order to have that tremendous adaptability, the brain has to be able to go in lots of directions. Once you start specializing, you lose the flexibility. So a simple example, any regular old average baby has the capacity to speak 1, 2, or 3 languages just by being exposed to it. The most brilliant person in the history of the world at age 30 cannot learn a new language as easily as any regular old 3-year-old can learn, because the brain has lost the ability to learn easily languages it hasn't been exposed to early on. So this concept of plasticity, which decreases over time, looks something like this. Now, let me just walk you through this for a second. So this is running from birth to age 70. If we had a wider screen, I could run this out to age 90, 100, 110. The bad news is that the drop is pretty steep in early childhood and then continuing, you just have a reasonable amount still in middle childhood and adolescence, and then it's not as steep a drop, but the plasticity decreases over age. Okay? The good news is it never gets to 0. Okay? And what that means is that there's always some plasticity in the brain, but less as it matures. And you already know the explanation for that because you understand this concept of the circuitry getting more and more complicated. When it's wide open, it can do lots of things. When it's heavily developed and it's pruned away things that it hasn't used, like the use it or lose it phenomenon, it can't go back and kind of redo that. It has to accommodate. Okay? So that's the bad news, is it drops. The good news is you never lose complete plasticity. So if there was someone here or listening on the webcast who was 105 years old and learns one thing that you did not know before you came in, and if you remember it tomorrow, that's the hitch, then you made some new connections in your brain. That's kind of how memory and learning work. Now the flip side of this is that as the brain becomes less plastic, the physiological energy required to adapt and make accommodations and shift goes up. I mean, this is measured by how much oxygen is utilized by brain cells, how much glucose needs to be metabolized. So the simple message here is that the adaptability decreases, and as that decreases, the effort, the cost, the physiological cost to the brain to adapt goes up. And without making any unnecessary analogy, because it's a clear, simple analogy, is not only is the physiological cost to the brain higher to make adjustments later, but the financial cost to society is also higher for the same reason. As a child gets older, the brain is more difficult to kind of adapt and reconnect. So the good news is that there's no such thing as a child or an adult being too old to be able to improve. Okay, so throw out that idea that the window closes at age 3. And for all of us who kind of wish that we could change some of the things about us, there's hope because there's plasticity, but it's harder. Okay, and the longer it goes, the harder it is. What's that?
There's less hope.
Well, there's always hope, but the cost is much higher, and the outcome, even though you can always make progress, will never be as good as it would have been had you gotten it right the first time. So if you want to put that on a bumper sticker, earlier is better than later. Prevention is better than treatment, but it's never too late. These are basic biological principles. Now, I now want to shift and talk about, so what happens when bad things happen to kids? So everything up until now was, this is how normal development takes place. This is how experience shapes brain circuits. And by the way, we haven't talked about other parts of the body that I'm going to get to now. So now the shift is, this is the story. This is the story of development. So once upon a time, this is how it happens, and now something bad happens. So what's going on biologically when something bad happens? So first I'm going to show you some data. Can't help it, I work in a university, I have to show data, but you'll understand it. So these are going to be, I'm going to show you data from a study done of about somewhere around 1,200 children across the country, all active cases in the child welfare system because of abuse or neglect. And the question was, in addition to having been abused or neglected, what is the relationship between the number of additional risk factors in a child's life? Limited parent education, a low family income, exposure to family violence. As the number of risk factors increases, what happens to the percentage of children who fail a developmental test at age 3? And you get now the pattern that is one of the most reproduced patterns in all of psychology, and you'll soon see biology as well, that we're not that fragile, so 1 or 2, 3 risk factors, still most kids are hanging in there. But by the time you get to 5, 6, 7 risk factors, and let's go 6 and above, at this point, 90 to 100% of the children are failing a developmental test at age 3. And this is not just emotional difficulties and social problems. This is language delays, delays in cognition. This is eligibility by any state standards for special education beginning even in the early childhood, in the infant toddler period for early intervention services, and on the way to special education. Now, this pattern is not surprising for people who understand something about development. What it means is that the pileup of adversity affects the brain and produces problems in learning. Now, what about the relationship between adverse experiences in childhood and the risk of having heart disease 50 years later or 60 years later? So this is not so intuitive, right? I mean, you might say, if I had more time to talk, and it's good that I don't because we'll have conversation, I'd show you slides in between that show as the number of risk factors increases, the likelihood of having drinking problems goes up, the likelihood of substance abuse, the likelihood of depression. And you might say, you know, how many of my tax dollars went to that study? That the more people had much more adversity in early childhood were more likely to be depressed when they were adults. It's like, it's intuitive, but it's also been demonstrated. But it's not intuitive that it should affect your risk for heart disease. And here's what it looks like. So for those who had reported 7 or more adverse experiences in childhood, had a 3-fold greater likely of having cardiovascular disease later on. And the same pattern has been shown for diabetes, hypertension, stroke, various forms of cancer, and a variety of other physical as well as mental health conditions. So we're beginning to build a story here, and I'm not making any of this up, a story that there's something about the pileup of adversity, not some bad things that happen, but the pileup of adversity that affects your brain in the way that influences your development. And that seems to also be potentially affecting your physical and mental health. So what is that all about? And these are kind of, you know, based on people remembering their childhood histories. So now we come to some very compelling data from a study from New Zealand, a town named Dunedin in New Zealand, where in a given year, over 30 years ago, every pregnant woman was enrolled in a study. And data have been collected through the pregnancy and all through the child's childhood into adolescence and into adulthood. Social data, medical data, blood tests were drawn, all kinds of things to be able to kind of follow in a population of 1,100 individuals to learn about what influences health and what influences development. These data are taken at age 32 years, okay, looking at the level in the blood of something called C-reactive protein, or CRP. Some of you may know about this. This is something you can measure in a blood test that's been associated with an elevated risk to have heart disease. So it means you're at increased risk for heart attack, kind of like having a whopping cholesterol level. This is not just a single study. There's a whole body of literature on this. So we don't entirely know what that's about, but this protein in the blood is a marker of elevated inflammation in the body. And we do know that inflammation is associated with accelerated atherosclerosis. That's very well established. It's not just about blood lipids, it's also, there's an inflammatory component to that. So here were data taken at age 32. Found that about a little over between 15 and 20% of healthy, normal 32-year-olds with no history of any problems and healthy exams at the time had elevated C-reactive protein. What does that mean? Well, you know, we don't know, except we know that statistically there's something about being at greater risk for heart disease. If you looked at those who had a diagnosis of depression at age 32, about 25%, a higher rate, had elevated C-reactive protein, which is consistent with several other studies that have been done to show that there seems to be an inflammatory component to depression. That people who have clinical depression have had repeated reports of elevated inflammation as part of that. Now, whether that's the cause of the depression or the result of the depression is yet to be figured out, but the association is very clear. So this was just confirming things that had been studied before. Here was a new finding. At age 32, individuals who had a documented history of having been maltreated in childhood had C-reactive proteins that exceeded 30%. 30% of those who had been maltreated years later had elevations in C-reactive protein. Had never been reported before. And those who had a history of maltreatment and a diagnosis of depression at age 32 had even higher levels. So I'll be a scientist now and say, what does this mean? Well, who knows what this means? I mean, it could mean a lot of things. But what it clearly means is this is part of a growing body of science, of scientific data, to say that there's something about adversity early in life that is producing biological changes that are detectable years later. This is one of many systems involved in the stress response, but there's clearly, if this were just the first time finding, you would say, well, maybe it's a fluke. A recent study in the UK of children who had been significantly maltreated in middle childhood at age 12 were found to also have elevated C-reactive proteins. First time this has been reported in individuals as young as age 12. There's something going on here. There's irrefutable scientific evidence now that things that happen early in life are creating physiological changes that are associated with vulnerability to illness. So what we're going to do now is go to the next short video, which is going to give you a very quick overview of what we've been starting to call the biology of adversity. Understand what is it about this evidence of early adversity? What is it doing to the body inside? How do we understand this? So let's, as they say, roll it, right? Okay.
Learning to deal with stress is an important part of healthy development. When experiencing stress, the stress response system is activated. The body and brain go on alert. There's an adrenaline rush, increased heart rate, and an increase in stress hormone levels. When the stress is relieved after a short time, or a young child receives support from caring adults, the stress response winds down and the body quickly returns to normal. In severe situations, such as ongoing abuse and neglect, where there is no caring adult to act as a buffer against the stress response stays activated. Even when there is no apparent physical harm, the extended absence of response from adults can activate the stress response system. Constant activation of the stress response overloads developing systems, with serious, lifelong consequences for the child. This is known as toxic stress. Over time, this results in a stress response system set permanently on high alert. In the areas of the brain dedicated to learning and reasoning, the neural connections that comprise brain architecture are weaker and fewer in number. Science shows that the prolonged activation of stress hormones in early childhood can actually reduce neural connections in these important areas of the brain at just the time when they should be growing new ones. Toxic stress can be avoided if we ensure that the environments in which children grow and develop are nurturing, stable, and engaging.
So again, I don't want to overstate this when you see this evidence of neurons being kind of chewed up. Okay? What this means is that there can be disruption of these circuits at a time when they're coming in. If that disruption isn't reduced during those sensitive periods of those circuits, the brain then moves up to the next level of circuit building, and the level that's completed is completed in a disruptive fashion. Now, this is not a death sentence. This doesn't mean that a child is now doomed to poor outcomes. What it means is now the system has to work harder. The system is going to have to accommodate to a faulty structure. Okay? And so for those of you, some of you, well, this is an interesting thing. So for those of you who've been involved in remodeling houses, maybe you'd have to go someplace where they sell things to remodel houses. Okay. You know that sometimes you make plans and the contractor or whoever you're working with says, you know, this is a really nice design, but we haven't gotten into the walls yet and we don't really know what the plumbing's going to look like and the wiring, and there may be a crack in the foundation. We're at a point where actually it will cost you less to tear this down and start over again and build a new house, and you'll have a better house, okay? Which is true, but you can't do that with a human brain. You can't tear it down and start all over. So if there's a crack in the foundation, you've got to live with that crack in the foundation. You can't repair it, but you try to fix above that. This is a basic principle of biology. So I just want to be really clear, the concept of toxic stress, which is getting more attention now, is a concept. We don't have a biological measure. We don't have a blood test for toxic stress. We're at the edge of that frontier of research right now. A lot of people are working on that now, but this is a concept. It's just emerging, but it's a concept that all of the scientific community says, yes, that's right, that makes sense. It's just the scientists argue about what the exact mechanisms are that give us time to figure that out. But the issue of stress, and now we're getting to the biology of adversity, the biology of stress, to translate that into policy and practice is a challenge, especially in this society. This society has no sympathy for stress. Okay? We are a rugged individualism. Pull yourself up by your bootstraps. Don't ask the government, or don't ask other people to pay taxes to relieve your stress. And by the way, you think you have stress, you should hear what my life is like, right? So there's no, it's a kind of a losing proposition. And what we did is we looked at the science and we said, well, okay, or people would say, well, stress, that's character building. Learn to deal with it, you'll be stronger, you'll be competitively advantaged. So what we did is we got the scientists together and we said, so how do we explain this? And came up with this very simple 3-category taxonomy, a way of categorizing different kinds of stress. So that there is a type of stress. Now, my frame of reference here is young children. And when I talk about stress, I don't mean the cause of the stress. I mean the physiological response to stress. Everybody here knows what it feels like physically to be stressed. So capture that feeling. It's not what caused it, it's the feeling, whether it's a knot in your stomach or a stiff neck or whatever, a headache. And so there is something called positive stress, well, we kind of, characterize as such for young kids, which is the stress that you need to learn to deal with. This is the stress of the first day in a child care center, or the stress of having to share your toys, or not having 5 cookies just because you want to eat them all. And that activates the stress system of a young child and gets all the stress hormones going. But kids learn, with the support of adults, how to cope, how to deal with that, develop their own stress coping mechanisms. And what's happening physiologically is the stress system's coming back to baseline, protecting the body from excessive activation. And children who are never allowed to experience stress are in big trouble. You've got to learn that. This is not about eliminating stress. The second category, excuse me, we call tolerable stress. This is more than just you have to go in for a nap. I mean, this is the stress of being a survivor of Hurricane Katrina or the tsunami in Japan, or that's the stress of a death in the family, or a serious injury, or some kind of real trauma, where we worry about who's going to end up with some kind of post-traumatic stress disorder. And the difference between children who come out of that healthy and those who come out with problems, we're postulating, has to do with whether there are adults who help the children get through these circumstances, help them feel a sense of safety and security, and physiologically help their systems get back to baseline. And by the way, the reason why this makes sense, so before we had all this biology, it's like 100 years ago, or when our species was first evolving, it's like people didn't know about the biology of the stress system, but there was a natural instinct in crisis for adults to kind of protect children and give them a sense of safety. And it's built into our biology. Okay, so that's tolerable stress, which gets the system back to baseline before it does damage, which leads us to the third category that we call toxic stress, because it is literally toxic. It's the excessive, prolonged activation of all of these systems that basically can do toxic damage to a developing brain and other developing organs. And this now begins to explain why this adversity is associated with these problems later on. So the take-home message from all of this is that early life experiences are literally built into our bodies, okay? For better or for worse, good experiences, supportive relationships, good learning opportunities, good healthy brain circuitry, healthy immune system, you're on your way. Poor experiences, excessive activation of the stress system, well, that's more problematic. So that we know that research on the biology of stress, as we've talked about before, shows us that when the heart rate goes up, the blood pressure goes up, stress hormones go up, blood sugar goes up, the inflammatory response is on fire. This is the fight or flight syndrome. This is life-saving. This is what allows us to deal with threat. I mean, if you were like, well, whatever, when you're threatened, you wouldn't make it. It's kind of like your body is ready to either run or fight. But it wasn't designed to be activated most of the time. It was designed to kind of biologically get back to baseline. And when you're little and you can't go out on your own, we're biologically designed to provide the protection for kids to get down. Because remember, humans are helpless for the longest period of time after birth compared to any other animal. And the reason for that also is it takes our brain longer to develop, but in the end it does a lot more than any other animal's brains can do. And the same stuff accelerates atherosclerosis. It causes dysfunction of the immune system. So now I'm pretty soon going to be moving from telling you about the science to then speculating about how we can use it. So the beginning of the speculation is this suddenly becomes a very powerful framework for trying to explain what is it about deep poverty, what is it about exposure to violence, what is it about discrimination, and what is it about maltreatment that leads to a greater likelihood to have problems learning, problems paying attention, more heart disease, more diabetes, more hypertension. It's not, it has nothing to, it can't, it's more than just what your attitude is, right? I mean, there's something biologically going on. So now I want to kind of move to the last part of the presentation, which is to move from this is the science, your crash course in science is over, and now begins your quick little seminar in how could we apply this science to policy and practice to deal with what are arguably the most challenging issues facing our society and many societies around the world. Inadequate educational achievement, economic dependence, unlawful behavior, and the high cost of incarceration, and elevated rates of disease. That also cost a lot of money. So there are basically three strategies. One is to enhance the quality of the services that we provide and increase access. And a lot of work is being done on that. Congratulations in Georgia that you're doing a lot of work on quality rating systems for your early childhood programs, because there's a lot of variability in the quality of programs. And poor quality programs do not do good. Okay? Just having a program is not good enough. It has to work. It has to be good. It has to have the qualities and capacities necessary. So that's one area that needs a lot of work, and a lot of good stuff is happening here about that. A second area is expanding effective models. We have this history of developing a demonstration project that shows what could happen, and then we don't take it to scale. We just write papers about it forever and ever. Or even worse, we take something that works and we say, so let's take it to scale, but you know, we don't have that much money, so let's have people with half the training do it, and let's give them twice as many kids to work with so we can stretch the dollars. And anybody who's in business knows that that is not a formula for a successful business. Is, you know, the quality of the product in the end is going to make you or break you. So that's another challenge. But the third is the one I want to talk about, which is above and beyond doing the best with what we know, it's taking the field to the next place. To use the science to build and test and promote new theories of change, new ideas, new ways of thinking that could translate into new kinds of policy initiatives and new kinds of interventions that will get a much bigger bang for the buck. Because the best of what we have almost half a century of program evaluation data in early childhood, and we have asked and answered the question multiple times, with the answer being yes, we can improve outcomes for children who are statistically at risk for poor educational achievement. We can improve outcomes, increase high school graduation rates, decrease special education. No question about that. But we have yet to show that we can eliminate the disparities and eliminate all the preventable problems in learning. And not to mention the disparities in health, which although we've made progress in reducing some parts of the education gap, we've had no dent on racial and income-related disparities in health in the last 40 years. They haven't budged, not one iota. So it is time for new ideas. The science has something to say about this. So this is kind of the way we're thinking about this. So now I'm just sharing with you what we're thinking. If I had been here 6 months before, I would have something different to say. And I sure hope I have something different to say 6 months from now. But I'm kind of opening up, or as in Steve Jobs' biography, for those of you who have read it, you know, kind of opening up the kimono at Xerox PARC, right? Kind of showing you what we're thinking, because we're like to invite you to kind of push back or to expand our thinking beyond that. So we're taking these scientific principles that are rock solid science and doing the following. So first we're asking, what's the conceptual framework? What's the theory of change that's driving our current policies and practices right now? And it looks something like this. It says that if we have some combination of, and this is basically targeting the population that's at risk because of low parent education, kind of social distress, okay, with or without associated problems like mental health problems, substance abuse problems, exposure to violence, and the problems of discrimination. So our theory of change now, driving most of our programs, said some combination of parenting education, providing information for parents about things to do to promote children's learning, good nutrition, stimulating experiences for the children and good quality center-based programs, and a health-promoting environment that basically reduces, preventable injuries and increases the likelihood that children will get more exercise and will eat well, that if you provide a combination of those things, you'll get a healthy developmental trajectory. And for a majority of the population, that works even without programs, okay? And for some part of the population at risk, programs that provide or support families with what they can't do on their own also work, and we maintain good developmental trajectories. But there's a part of the population at risk for whom this is not enough, and we don't get the kinds of outcomes we're looking for. And we ignore that at our peril. And by the way, one of the biggest problems is sometimes we don't get impacts because the families don't even participate or they drop out of programs. And when we say, well, just, well, people aren't motivated. But that's not an answer. So the question is, what's going on? Why do these programs not work? And so our hypothesis is, because for some part of the population, the level of adversity that the children and the families are experiencing overwhelms the capacity of those services to counteract them and result in excessive activation of stress response systems that are compromising children's ability to benefit from enriched environments and that are responsible for the continuing disparities in health. And by the way, some of them, we're living through this out-of-control epidemic of obesity, right? We're also living with markedly increased prevalence of diabetes among low-income children more than high-income children. This is not a sudden genetic mutation. Okay? So there's a lot of stuff going on that's interfering with good outcomes. So this is our hypothesis. This is our working model about why we're not getting better impacts for that part of the population who are not benefiting as much, which, by the way, all of us have a huge investment in improving outcomes. And you can pick your reason. You can pick your reason because it's a compelling moral imperative. That one's good enough for me. You can pick your reason because from a pure economic perspective, this huge costs down the road in special education, in economic dependence, and the big enchilada incarceration, which is the most expensive bad outcome. So the question is, what could we do? So here's some thinking that we're doing right now about how we might use science to shape some new ideas to go forward. We haven't tried any of these things yet. We're literally, as I speak, we have people who are working on developing some ideas that we're about to try on the ground. And we won't have the answer in 2 months about whether they're making a difference or not. But this is where many of us feel the field needs to go. So the science would say that maybe one thing we should think about is to create a new generation of protective interventions that don't replace, but that are added to the enrichment approach. That the enrichment, the information-giving approach, the kind of the loose social support approach, which works in many cases, in some instances needs to be complemented by some kind of protective interventions that will reduce the impact of adversity on children biologically, which is taking its toll. So then the question comes up, okay, big shot, so how are you going to do that, right? So here's our thinking, okay? And this is the thinking, it's not my thinking alone. This is the thinking of an amazingly exciting group of scientists and policymakers and practitioners and philanthropists around the country who are coming together to kind of develop some new ideas and then put them to test on the ground. That will buffer this adversity and keep the developmental curve where it needs to be. So the question is, what kinds of strategies could we develop to enhance the life prospects of vulnerable young children who are not adequately served by existing services? So we start with what we have. I'm not talking about wiping the slate clean and beginning all over again. We start with what we have. So basically, we've identified 2 goals that need to be addressed. One is reducing barriers to learning. So this is the flip side of enhancing learning. This is reducing barriers to learning. And the other is building foundations of health. I will say, as a pediatrician, I'm ready to get up on the soapbox on this one. Early childhood policy and programs in this country are an education issue. They're about school readiness. They're about improving educational outcomes, which is right. Absolutely right, but only half the story. Actually, even less than half the story. And you could finish the paragraph for me now. This is as much about promoting lifelong health and preventing disease as it is about promoting literacy, right? Because if we understand the science, the roots of disruption of learning are also the same routes, just move south from the brain to the cardiovascular system, or move out to the immune system, or move down to the pancreas and get into some of the metabolic regulatory systems, and it's as much about disease prevention. And so the way we think of it now, we think of this is an education issue, this is in the education budget, and we say, oh, but health is important, so let's make sure the kids have a doctor. Let's make sure their immunizations are up to date. Let's make sure they get screening for health problems. You will never find a pediatrician get up in front of you and say that well child care is unnecessary. Okay? But what I am saying is the science says that solving the health problems facing many children in this country cannot be done in the doctor's office alone. And it's not going to be done in the hospital. It has to do with much broader issues. So the question is, what could we do in a system right now where the learning issues are focused on the child and the health issues are focused on the child? Checkups and exposure to early literacy experiences. So in our thinking, we said, well, so we should basically look, since our understanding of toxic stress is that the key to turn toxic stress into tolerable stress is for adults to buffer children against those adversities and provide the support to get the stress system back down to baseline, is we need some new approaches to strengthen the capacities of parents and caregivers who work in programs to mitigate the effects of toxic stress. So we started to think about this. Now, before I get to the next slide and explain the heart of this, I want to just put up the issues here. So remember, our approach now is to give information to people. We have parents with limited education and limited income, we give them advice. We have people who work in programs, a lot of the staff in childcare programs, fantastically dedicated people, some of whom have well-developed educational credentials in early childhood, and many in child care centers who are low-income women with limited education, right? Who are basically not much different from the low-income women with limited education whose children need good quality childcare. And what do we do for the staff? We do professional development, which is giving information. Okay? So what we started to think about is what's going on in the brain. What's going on in the brain for people who have had tough lives themselves, and what's going on in people's environment that are increasing or decreasing their ability to buffer children against toxic stress. And we came up with 4 things to focus on. One is mental health. We know there are high rates of maternal depression in the country at all income levels, and in low-income families, the rates have been reported as high as 1 out of 2 women have significant depression. Well, if you're significantly depressed, it's really hard to be consistently responsive to a young baby. It has nothing to do with how much you love the baby. It has to do with the consequences of an illness. I mean, depression is an illness. It's not caused by it's not cured by encouraging people to be more responsive to their children. It's an illness that needs attention. There are also issues related to self-regulation and executive function I'm going to talk about in the next slide. And the last piece is economic stability. So we have this whole part of our policy world that deals with trying to build workforce capacity, and all through our TANF system and others that are basically trying to get people back to work. Okay? And none of that's connected to the early childhood system. In the early childhood system, we say, well, we should refer people to help on that. And in the workforce system, they don't pay attention to the kids, even though those women, most of them have children. Okay? So these are the issues that need attention, because these are all what are interfering with the ability to buffer children from adversity. So let me tell you a little bit about executive functioning and self-regulation, which we have started to focus on, as have a lot of other people. Which we have a working paper out that explains this. We call it the air traffic control system in your brain, okay? This is what executive function and self-regulation involve. These are the kinds of skills we're talking about. Planning, monitoring, problem solving, self-control, working memory, the ability to focus your attention, to resist distraction, to control your impulses, follow directions, solve problems, adjust to changes in rules of priorities, okay? These are the kinds of things. The front part of the brain, the prefrontal cortex, is the part of the brain where all these skills develop. And in the animations, this was the higher level cognitive skills. It's more than just can you talk, can you remember. It's how you organize yourself. These are skills that develop early on in life and mature. I'll show you in a second how wide a span that is. They are skills that can be taught. They are skills that can be coached. They are skills that get better with practice. Okay? So here's the dilemma. And some of this now just the last 5 years, this is so new, right? I mean, in the last 5 years, there have been several reports to show that social class differences in the development of the prefrontal cortex, which is where a lot of these skills are, start to appear in infancy. Infancy, differences in brain development in that part of the brain. And behavioral and developmental studies for a while have shown differences beginning in early childhood based on the kind of families kids live in, of how much kids can pay attention, sit still, control their impulses. I mean, you get the picture. The kind of thing that every kindergarten teacher will tell you is much more important than how many letters you can recognize about whether you're going to succeed in school. Okay. Now we're going to get into areas where we have no data whatsoever. No one studied it, but let's use our imagination. So you have these differences appearing in early childhood. You don't have access to good supports. You go to school. You don't have the greatest. I'm not going to dump on the school system. It's a poor school system. Everybody dumps on the school system. But let's say it's not, you don't have the greatest educational experience. You started out behind. You have trouble paying attention. You have trouble organizing yourself. You're not very successful in school. The chances are that you're getting better at these skills is pretty low. Okay? So the gap is getting bigger and bigger between children who are well organized and have good attentional skills and are getting the reinforcement of positive learning. And now maybe you graduate high school, maybe you don't. And by then, the difference between a high school graduate going to college and someone who's not going to graduate high school in terms of how good all of your executive function and self-regulation skills are, we don't have the data, but you can imagine, right? So now what happens? So maybe you get a job, maybe you don't. If you don't get a job, it's unlikely you're going to develop these skills better. If you do get a job with that limited education, it's going to be a job that probably won't tax and develop those skills. And now you get pregnant. And you have a baby. Okay? The ultimate challenge to executive function skills to the most highly educated, high-income individual is taking care of a little baby, right? It is the ultimate challenge to self-regulation, to not want to throw that kid against the wall when the kid won't stop crying, to be able to manage the feeding and the sleeping. And I still don't know. I'm a parent myself. How did we get through night after night for months before you can even sleep through the night? I mean, it's like crazy. And so, and now we say to families in that situation, here are some things to do with your kid. Talk to your kid more, read to your kid. I'll see you next week, right? So basically, our theory here is that what's missing is not information, but skill building. Okay? And the same thing in programs. So we have, in the quality rating systems, we have some programs that are not very good quality. So we have, by and large, people with limited education. We don't pay them very much. And we give them 15 toddlers and preschoolers to manage and say, go to it. You know? And it's the ultimate test of self-regulation and monitoring and all that stuff. So our brilliant idea is maybe we should be teaching some of these skills. So are these skills teachable? Well, here's where science, again, has a wonderful message for us. So this is showing the development of the prefrontal cortex, which is where all these skills are developed. So I'll go back for a second. Two other parts of the brain. There's a part of the brain called the amygdala, which is where the basic fear and threat circuitry is built. It's fully mature by 18 months. It's over. I mean, the first 18 months, if you've been threatened and dealing with threat, you've got bad circuitry, you've got it forever. You can be helped, but boy, you'll never be as good as you could have been in that. The hippocampus, memory, simple learning, mostly mature by the time you start kindergarten, fully mature by the middle childhood. The prefrontal cortex, the other of the three parts that is most sensitive to the disruptive effects of these stress hormones, the most sensitive, this is what its maturation looks like. So it has this big, steep increase between birth and the beginning of middle childhood, where it's rapidly developing its circuitry. So it's very sensitive. This is a period of plasticity. Then it kind of slows down for a while, and it has another peak in adolescence and early adulthood, and doesn't fully mature until age 25 to 30. I'm not making this up. This is real science. So what this is telling us is the one part of the brain that has the longest period of plasticity, and not surprisingly, because it's the part that has all the skills that make humans different from every other animal species. We've got time. We've got time. First of all, we've got a lot happening early on, so this matters early on. But we also have a period of plasticity just at the time when a lot of parents who have limited education and low income are trying to manage their kids' lives. And we could be building skills in an area where the brain has not really fully matured, okay? And we're giving information. Okay, so for a lot of people, giving the information is good, but for some people, our hypothesis is this is so ripe for some new attention. And it means just skill building instead of information dispensing. Is this, no, there will be no silver bullet, but is this a big breakthrough? I'll stay tuned. But it's going to take a few years to even begin to figure out how to do this. But this is an example of where, if you were in the business world, you'd be investing for the long haul. And you'd say, well, we're going to use most of our resources to deliver the best product we have now, but we're going to have an R&D component that's going to be figuring out how to be the first ones to get to where the field's going next. This could be an important place where the field's going next. By not investing in trying this or other things, we're losing huge opportunities. So here are the sensitive periods. Preschool and adolescence and young adulthood. Could you ask for anything better? If you believe that evolution has some intelligence to it, there's a reason why it's giving some extra period. If you believe in intelligent design, you could say this is the way God made it. Either way, this is real. Okay? These are open, these are windows of opportunity that we really ought to be grabbing at. So I'm going to end by just kind of trying to go back to where I started, which is that we have multiple streams of services and policies, but really only one science here, right? So if we brought an integrated science base to a whole range of problems and a whole range of policy domains, get all the different, well, you don't have cabinets in this, you don't have a cabinet in this state, right? You have different agencies, but whatever it is, you bring all the different agency people together with one science. So we have a growing, very rich science that helps us understand, beginning to understand, what determines health outcomes, beginning from conception, actually preconception, to adulthood. Because now it's not just infancy, it's all the stuff that happens prenatally. And now there's also a lot of evidence that the health of a woman before she becomes pregnant is already an influence on how the pregnancy is going to go and how the outcome is going to be. But there's a lot of knowledge waiting to be used. I mean, people are using it on the medical side. We're kind of revolutionizing the way we treat disease. I mean, in 10 or 20 years, nobody's going to recognize what goes on in hospitals. It's sitting there waiting to be used to address social challenges as well. And why ignore it, okay? So what we know is that in the end, the difference between healthy development and poor development, the difference between physical and mental health and physical and mental illness has to do with the balance between whether the body is developing adaptive biological responses or is biology being disrupted. And we're learning more and more about that, and I've given you a little bit of flavor for that. We also know what the foundations are of healthy development that tip the scale toward adaptation rather than disruption. 3 simple categories. The big one is supportive, stable, responsive relationships. It's key. It's key. This is not like from my heartstrings. This is hard science. It's like that's what buffers the system from excessive activation of the stress response. Relationships are key. Second is good nutrition, critically important. And third is the environment, the physical environment in which children live. Is it safe or is it threatening? It has to do with neurotoxins in the environment. Is the water clean? Is the food supply clean? You know, are there protections against injury to people who put their kids in seatbelts? Okay. We also know that the capacities of the people who take care of young children and the communities they live in are key to either strengthening or weakening these foundations, particularly on the relationship side, but even on the other side. So in order to strengthen those relationships, we need capacities in people who take care of kids. And whether anybody likes it or not, it doesn't just include family members, it includes other people. Okay? It just kind of is the way it is. The research is still really clear. Parents are still the greatest influence on their kids' development, but there are other people playing very important roles. And finally, we have the levers for intervention in policy and practice. And this is where every agency you can think of has a potential role. So in the old days, we'd say, so what this means is we need a good early care and education system, and we need a good primary health care system. And the answer is still true today, you bet. We need that. But we also need a good child welfare system. We need a good community development system. We need a good housing kind of policy. We need good public health. Okay? All of these things have a potential impact on the extent to which we will be promoting or disrupting the lives of young children. So if we put that lens, if we put the early childhood health lens and development lens in each of these areas, we could ask the question of, well, what is this doing to strengthen relationships or undermine relationships? What is this doing to make the environment healthier or make it less healthy? So it's a very simple logic model. It starts with policies and programs, and by the way, it includes the private sector as well, and it includes communities. This is not just about government programs. You do not need a law for a workplace to decide that it's going to provide some kind of paid leave after someone has a baby. Okay? You don't need a law to tell a workplace that it will allow a parent some time off to take a kid for a doctor's appointment or go see a play at a preschool program and not lose a half a day of pay. You don't need laws to do that. So this is not just about government. This is about the workplace, and it's about communities. Communities don't have to be ordered to provide supports for families. They can do it on their own. So it's a very simple logic model. The levers, the policy and program levers, work not because they raise children. They work because they build caregiver and community capacities, which then build the foundations that make for more biological adaptations that result in healthy development throughout the lifespan. So this is my take-home message. This is the summary of the whole presentation. Okay? We have for a long time known that kids who grow up in poverty have more health and learning problems. Kids who are victimized by discrimination don't do as well in school. Kids who've been abused or neglected or exposed to violence have more problems later. What we need to understand better is, how does that happen? What is it about those things that creates the poor outcomes? That's step 2, being more explicit. We have programs and policies that are in place to improve educational outcomes. And we have programs to improve health outcomes. And we say, well, we do these programs, and the kids do better. And that's okay, that's good. And if everything was solved, we wouldn't even care what's going on. But everything isn't solved. So the question is, what could we do differently? We have to be more explicit about step 2. What explains the link between adversity and poor outcomes? What explains programs that succeed and differentiates them from programs that don't? And my message to you this evening is that science has more to offer now than political partisanship and ideology. Okay? I mean, we're really not going to make any step forward from where we are by arguing about political values. Okay? Nor should we pretend that that doesn't matter. Obviously, it matters in terms of what people are going to do. But if we start with a political argument, we end with a political argument, and we never get to the questions of what could we be doing better that we would all benefit from. And that's kind of where I think the science has a role to play. So this is our website. For those of you who want more material, we have a lot of material in various forms, including those videos, which you're welcome to download and use anywhere you want. We're giving it all away because we just want people to understand the science and use it. So I'll end where I began, which is to thank you very much for the opportunity to talk with you tonight, and now open this up for discussion. So thank you.
Are you ready for this?
I'm ready.
Well, first I want to thank you, Jack. For those of you who don't know, he has devoted his whole day to the state of Georgia. We started this morning early at the governor's office and met with Governor Deal. He was very, very interested in this intersection between health and early learning and communities being involved in that intervention, and couldn't have been more supportive and interested in the work that Jack is doing. In fact, asked for Jack's commitment to come back and work with the state of Georgia. I also want to point out that we have Commissioner Bobby Cagle here of the Department of Early Care and Learning, and Dr. Brenda Fitzgerald from the Department of Public Health as well. And before we get to the questions, I want to just set the stage a little bit about Georgia. Over 60% of our children are in care outside of the home. That's one fact that we know. The other, through some of the work that Dr. Fitzgerald has done, is that we also know that about 25% of the children being born in this state at any time are flagged for these type of toxic stress environments. So this is not an insignificant number. This is affecting a huge, huge number of our children. The numbers are too big to ignore. So one of the first questions that I would want to ask is that intuitively, we know that violence, extreme poverty, extreme neglect are going to cause poor outcomes. That's the stuff our grandmother taught us. But I think that there's some other stressors that we may not realize that have to do with, as you mentioned, maternal depression that can cross any kind of socioeconomic lines. Consistent poor malnutrition can be a stressor for a child as well. So knowing all of this, knowing that these factors exist for so many of our children, but also knowing at this point in time, we are limited with resources and what the state and the communities can do. If I had to force you to pick one intervention to focus on as a state, where would you lead us first?
Right. Such a hard question to start with. Right? So, well, at the risk of repeating myself and picking out of some of the things I said before, you know, I think it's pretty clear. It doesn't matter what my opinion is. If you look at this kind of overwhelming knowledge base, there's no question that the gold is around the relationships that children have with the important people in their lives. That, and so if I were to do one thing, I would kind of look at every policy and every program and every system that we have and ask each of them to look at how they're organized and how they're delivering their services and ask how they could enhance what they're doing in a way that would strengthen the relationships that parents have with their children, particularly parents who need support. You know, I'll tell you, I have met, so in the same way that I have met very few people from one end of the political spectrum to another who don't like children, even though they disagree with what to do. I haven't met people who really want to see bad things happen to children. I haven't seen many parents who really don't care about the well-being of their children. But there are a lot of people who are living in circumstances where they're not able to give their children everything they need, and they need support to do that, not that that's not within their intention. And I think when you put that question in terms of looking at how are our systems, our policies, our programs strengthening relationships as opposed to weakening them, and how are we empowering and strengthening the capacity of people who work in systems to strengthen relationships, that would be a huge step forward. So the kinds of things that would happen would be, we'd look at things like moving kids from one home to another in the child welfare system. That's not good. We'd have a new understanding of why job turnover in child care centers is a problem. It's not just an economic problem of having to recruit and retrain, but every time a child loses a relationship and has to start a new one, that's a stressor. So this is a problem for the children, not just a problem for the administration. Okay? I would look at the issue of how much we're asking the healthcare system. I'll be a little parochial about this for a second. You know, we ask pediatricians to screen for problems, and we mandate screening sometimes, and then which allows the privilege of identifying problems for which you can't get help, or making referrals to programs that have waiting lists, or programs that don't have waiting lists and have a lot of people who mean well but are overwhelmed and are not prepared to deal with the problems we're sending them. So I think there's a way, none of these things necessarily cost a lot more money. They have to do with using the money we're spending in a more effective way.
So recently, the American Academy of Pediatrics released a policy statement that you helped draft, which was released in December, and I want to read this to you. It says, "It is not adversity alone that predicts poor outcomes. It is the absence of or insufficiency of healthy relationships that reinforce healthy adaptations to stress." So knowing that, and knowing that as much as we might try to reinforce what's occurring in the home and help parents with that relationship, it's not always going to happen there.
Right.
So can you speak to how high quality early education can benefit that and why we need that as an investment in our communities?
So I think it's a very important question, Stephanie. It gets to this issue of what people loosely call parent engagement, right? I mean, we all understand, and I don't mean just pay lip service. I mean, people understand that. But there's also a lot of lip service to kind of the concept of parent engagement. And sometimes it means, you know, at some periodic intervals, you have a parent night, or you send a report home at the end of the day and said, Johnny had 2 meatballs today and had 3 stools or something like that, and or basically giving people information, and it's a lot of it is constrained by time and training. So what we're doing is, I think a lot of the early care and education, first of all, there are early care and education programs that are models of doing this really well, where parents are engaged, and there's good communication, and there's reinforcement on both ends. So this is not a totally broken system by any means. But I think for the toughest kids in the toughest circumstances who need more than just okay, we have kind of glossed over that where there are families whose needs we can't meet. And this is my own opinion. I think we have a tradition of an environment that is unsafe to try things and unsafe to say you're not making a big difference because you're afraid you'll lose your funding, right? So we pay a lot of lip service to evaluation and collecting data. And let's be honest, maybe I shouldn't say this in something that's webcast and everything, but what the heck, I've already started. There are no incentives to do honest evaluation in this field. There are incentives to collect data to show that things are going well. And the fact is that things often do go well, but for the children in the toughest circumstances, it's hard to imagine how, given the training that people have, we could be meeting a lot of these needs. And so a lot of these families kind of break away from programs, they don't get served, and we kind of just move on. So I think early care and education could be a great vehicle for meeting a wider range of needs if we gave that system the resources to deal with the complexity of problems that they're asked to deal with. There are 2 canaries in the mine on this. One is we have large numbers of kids who are expelled from child care centers. Child care center says, take your kid home and don't bring him back. I can't manage his behavior. I don't think in many cases that night at the dinner table, the family sits around and says, well, gee, this is going to be a problem in kindergarten, so I guess we better get our act together. It's like, these are families in trouble. And the other canary in the mine is the skyrocketing increase in prescriptions being written for behavior management of young kids. And I don't mean just stimulants for ADHD. I mean antidepressants, and the big one, where this came from, I have no idea. Antipsychotic medications that are given to 2-year-olds and 3-year-olds to manage out-of-control behavior. It's legal because a doctor can write a prescription for any legal drug for anybody, but it's unconscionable because we don't know whether they work. We don't know what the potential harm is. And these are developing brains, and these are medicines that affect brain transmission. So these are not, the issue is not to punish people who are doing that. It's to recognize the pressure that doctors and schools are feeling to deal with problems that they can't manage. So we should be coming up with some better ideas.
But there is some evidence to support that for a child who's not receiving what they need at home, that a quality interactive relationship with an early care provider on a consistent basis can help mitigate that, correct?
Absolutely, absolutely. That is unquestionably true. That for many children, child care is the need to find a safe, decent place for your kids while you go to work. And for some children, there's an additional benefit, which is regular, good quality childcare can be a therapeutic intervention for children who otherwise are not receiving that kind of support, and can be a way to also work with the family to help build their supports. In the same way that for children who have childcare that's not the greatest, if the home situation is pretty good, not such great childcare is not going to destroy a young child. But when the home situation is poor and you get poor quality childcare, then that's a real double whammy, and those kids can manage that less. And in this case, the most vulnerable group are families who are really struggling just above the cutoff for eligibility for subsidized care. It's not necessarily the poorest families, it's the families who are just above the cutoff, whatever it is, who can't afford good quality care and aren't eligible for subsidies.
I want to open it up to some questions now from the audience. If you'll step to the mic so that everyone can hear your question. And I know the first gentleman speaking, Dr. Berkelhammer, if you'll introduce yourself.
Hi, Jay.
Fellow pediatrician.
Hi, Jay.
I think Georgia's a better place this evening than it was this morning. Thank you for all you've done for us today.
Thank you.
I wanted to ask you to put that first slide back up, and you did already, so thank you on that too. And you have a lot of my favorite organizations and programs that are there. I expect you must have some relationship with all of those.
That's not my slide. No, I don't.
Oh, that's our slide.
Yeah, that's yours. That's not
Oh,
mine.
I thought that was yours.
No.
Okay. Well, I'm gonna pick on Reach Out and Read and why that program works. And could you share with us some of your thinking about that program and why you think that science has shown that that program makes a difference?
Right. So for Reach Out and Read, for those of you who don't know about it, is a program in which pediatricians talk to parents about the importance of early literacy experiences and give out books as part of a doctor's visit. So, and there have been some studies that show that Reach Out and Read is associated with better vocabulary development and better reading scores later. So I'm not an expert on all of the data on Reach Out and Read, but so it's a personal opinion, okay? I think it's a wonderful example of something that can provide an enhancement for those situations where parents either might not be able to afford to buy books or may not appreciate the importance of reading to children when they're very young, kind of feeling like, well, child isn't old enough to read yet, so why would I read? And the data are pretty clear that there can be a benefit from that. But what I would caution is, and you can guess what I'm going to say from what I said, is that Reach Out and Read, in my mind, would be a mistake to think that Reach Out and Read is an answer for a family in deep trouble. So a family that's dealing with violence and mental health problems and substance abuse would feel that somehow we could turn things around by giving out books and suggesting that parents read to their kids. So I think this, to me, gets to this issue of this is not a one-size-fits-all field. And getting back to the issue of limited resources, there are clearly families who don't need any kind of publicly supported assistance to raise healthy kids. There are clearly families whose needs are relatively inexpensive and could be met by well-targeted interventions. There are clearly some families whose needs, in order to be met, and their children's needs, are going to require very expensive, highly specialized expertise. And we need to be better at distributing and matching needs to programs. There are undoubtedly, I mean, I don't know what's going on the ground in Georgia, but I assume no different from any place else. There are children and families getting more service than they need, and there are children and families who are not getting a drop in the bucket compared to what they need. And the worst is to spend money on services that are totally inadequate for what a family needs, because everybody's losing in that sense. And so I see Reach Out and Read as a very valuable resource for families for whom the books and the reading might not be there, and just providing that way will make a difference. But I don't see it as an answer for the kids in the biggest trouble.
I think one of the things, though, that Jay's question would lead me to is that very often you mentioned the silos that exist. And in working in early education, one of the silos that we've seen is you've got early education, you've got health, and I think the role of the pediatrician in our communities, because often it's the first professional individual that a parent may turn to, is an important one for you to talk about how we can begin to align some of what pediatricians are doing to impact some of the outcomes we want in education.
So I don't want to seem overly chauvinistic about kind of, speaking up for pediatricians, but what the heck, I'll do that anyway. It's, I think the one thing we know is that parents and the society at large and parents trust pediatricians. And so in that sense, pediatricians are tremendously valuable resources. But we're also very often asking pediatricians to deal with problems that are way beyond their capacity to deal with. Even if you had a 30-minute visit instead of a 7-minute visit, right, in an office. Pediatricians do not have the training to deal with a lot of these problems, nor do they have the leverage to deal with some. That's why I think the American Academy of Pediatrics deserves a huge amount of credit for the boldness of this statement, because what it also includes is a recognition that pediatrics has a tremendously important role to play, but it's not going to solve this problem by itself. And it also acknowledges that the answer is not just to kind of get more kids connected with existing services, but to get the right kids connected to things that work and to figure out some new strategies for things that we do not have good answers for right now. And that's where I think a safe political environment is critical to try new things, because we don't have effective interventions for children in the most desperate circumstances, or at least we don't have evidence they make a difference. And that is just not acceptable to kind of say, well, then it's too bad we don't have anything. We don't do that for diseases. We kind of figure out how to get treatments. And I don't want to call this a disease, but to say this is a huge threat to children's health and we need some new strategies.
we'll go to you.
Hi, I'm Catherine Cheek, and I'm a pediatrician, so I hate that
goodness.
all the pediatricians jumped up to the front. I'm the but you can't help, I appreciate all the things that you said. I'm president of the Georgia chapter. But I remember reading when I was a pediatric resident a great book by Elizabeth Shore, who I think also is at Harvard, Within Our Reach. And the thing from that book in the 80s that impressed me the most was the fact that she said if there's one person in a child's life that makes a difference, that stands up for that kid, that's an advocate, can really bring the child from the bottom of the barrel to somewhere where they can participate in our environment and be a healthy, positive influence for the future. Are you saying that in the last 20 years that we have gotten to a place that we can't identify that one positive person in their children's life, that there's so, and that's what I unfortunately see in my office, that these kids live in such scattered lives, they live in such horrible circumstances, surrounded by things that none of us want to even mention here. But reality check is that as a pediatrician, as a society, we have got to help these children find that one positive influence, because that was my hope in the 80s when I was a pediatric resident. If I can identify somebody that will advocate for this kid, whether it's their daycare worker or whether it's their parent or whether it's their pediatrician, we can make a difference. Is that
Right.
still there?
The first thing I'd say is I'm not smarter about that than you are. I don't know, but I'll give you my opinion. I think what we haven't done is not so much not able to find who's that one person for each kid, but to ask the question of what are we doing for that one person to help that one person give that kid what that kid needs. If you look at the last 10 or 20 years from a health point of view and a medical point of view, we have made dramatic progress in treating a variety of diseases. I mean, dramatic progress in terms of survival and in terms of quality of life. Okay? We have made improvements in decreasing the achievement gap by race, by some degree. We've made no progress in decreasing the achievement gap, the health gap by race or income. The achievement gap by income has doubled in the last 10 years nationally. I don't know what the Georgia statistics are, but 10 years ago it was half a standard deviation, and now it's a full standard deviation based on income. So we're moving in the wrong direction. And when you ask what else has changed in this time, because life has never been easy, we have made it harder and harder for people to balance work and family and manage a life, right? I mean, so 20 years ago, one income could support a family. Now, one income, for most people, can't support a family comfortably. We have made it really difficult to figure out how to pay for care for a child and to be at work. And we have a majority of kids growing up in single-parent families in many circumstances. Now, a lot of people have very strong value positions on single parenthood, on all kinds of other things. And I think that science has nothing to say about that. Okay? But what science can say is that in the absence of finding a way to strengthen that one person who can provide what that child needs, we can bet that things are going to get worse, not better. So I don't have a magic answer to that except to say that I think where to go look for it, we know. Everybody's interested in resilience, right? And there's a huge literature on resilience. The answer always, whether it's overcoming poverty, overcoming war, overcoming mental illness, there's always a person. There's a mentoring relationship. There's someone. And we're making it harder and harder for those people to do that. So I think we're going to have to figure that one out. But this is one that's very much a social and political issue. It's not a science issue.
We do, because we are on the webcast, we do have a Twitter conversation going on as well. And I want to check in with Indra, wherever Indra is, and see if we've got any questions that have come up on for Dr. Shonkoff via Twitter.
We've had some conversation with Child Trends, one of our partners, going back and forth on Twitter. And one thing that has come up is about let me find, I've got several questions here, about home visitation and the role of that and how is that playing nationally and in Georgia.
We love that question.
Everybody loves that question. So I'll give you the science and I'll give you my opinion if you want my opinion. So the science is very clear that we have evidence that certain forms of home visiting programs have clearly made a significant impact The one that everybody knows about that has the best data is the Nurse-Family Partnership, developed by David Oles, that's been studied in different places with an experimental design, and we know we can improve outcomes. But the outcomes were largely in decreased hospitalization and emergency room use and other kinds of things. We also have evidence, I'm not going to mention any names, of home visiting programs with people with much less training than the nurse programs that have variable impacts, many of which have been studied and have had very little impact. It depends on what the program is for. So here's my opinion. A program that has people with modest training who aren't paid very much to make home visits to new mothers who have very little social support and don't know much about babies can be a pretty low-cost, high-yield program where you give people information, give them some support, and it's a good investment. But why would anybody think that a person with very little training and not much expertise who's making home visits to someone who's dealing with violence and substance abuse and depression and not being able to put food on the table, independent of the studies which don't show any impact, your grandmother would also tell you that there's no reason why you would expect that would make an impact. So home visiting programs are not it's a category. There are all kinds of home visiting programs. And again, it's back to this issue of matching the expertise of the people providing the service with what you're asking them to do. So I wouldn't make a blanket statement. Some home visiting programs are fantastically successful, and others are not a good use of money if people are being asked to address problems that are way over their heads. And the people who hurt the most are the people who need the help, who are being home visited by wonderful, well-meaning people with a big heart who are not prepared to help them deal with their problems.
Well, I think the one takeaway, regardless of whether or not it's early child care environments, whether it's home visiting programs, is that quality and training are the key differences.
Absolutely.
And I think that's important for us to think about as we think about this quality rating system, which will, for the first time, be implemented in Georgia.
Absolutely.
But I want to go to the next question.
Good evening, and thank you so much for your presentation. I was so glad to be in the audience to hear. My name is Jenny Trotter, and I'm the founder and executive director of a nonprofit organization called Holistic Stress Control Institute. We've been doing stress education.
Why were you interested in it?
Right. We've been doing stress education for many years, and part of our organization was founded based on the Atlanta Missing and Murdered Children's Crisis, where we had a lot of stress in the area, just in the city. But there was something you said, and I wanted to share with you a little bit about a program we developed. We developed a preschool stress relief program back in the late 80s. To work with Head Start families and teachers and children. And your point you made here on one of the diagrams that showed that you said the opportunities to build executive functionings, and you said based on the frontal cortex of the brain with the opportunity for skill building is at its highest, and you said between 3 and 5, which is the preschool ages that we use, and then the parents, because you have parents very young, and you said what we need to do is build skills right now, and that's what the program had initially done. We did funding, and we're looking at more funding to do the program, but the mental health needs of the parents that we work with as well as the preschool really serve to say that we are needing more programs like this. And I know it's just not the program, but we did skills. We did breathing, we did yoga, we did even understanding a smile, acupressure skills that parents can learn to use very easily and convey to their children and vice versa. So I'll just say,
related to what you just said, is one of the things that we're experimenting with now in terms of trying to put some ideas together is to bring together a kind of executive function self-regulation approach with an early childhood mental health approach, because there's a lot of overlap between those two in terms of ability to self-regulate, ability to kind of have a sense of control. So when you start to bring people together from different disciplines, sometimes you're getting two perspectives, and other times you're getting two different ways of talking about the same thing, which is kind of really very valuable.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you for being here. I'm going to change gears a little. I would like to know, is there any studies done on the deficiency of leafy green vegetables that obviously the brain requires essential fatty acids and magnesium in the limbic system? And is that helping at all if you are doing any studies?
Where's my friend Bill Dietz? When I need
Bill's
him,
over
right?
here.
So, I mean, there's no question that nutritional issues are very important from the beginning of conception well into the first couple of years of life in terms of brain development. Okay? I am not an expert in that area, the one thing I will say about nutrition and young children and families who are economically stressed is that when you have less money, you can kind of put enough into the bellies of hungry children with cheap junk food than you can with nutritious food. And that's part of the problem, is that when people are stretching their dollars, good quality food costs more than junk. Is that a fair statement, Bill? Yes. Okay, thank you. You have to be careful when you have people who know a lot more than you do to pretend you're an expert. I do not pretend to be an expert in nutrition.
Lee.
Lee Torrance is my name. You had mentioned expanding effective models, and I was just wondering if you could share with us any public-private partnerships that you're aware of that we could potentially leverage here.
Here in Atlanta?
And in Georgia, yes.
I don't know enough about the local...
Or no, not locally here, but any that you've been exposed to, or as you talk about creating this buffer.
Yeah. It's a very important question, and it's a hard one for me to answer in terms of a specific program, because once again, I would think it depends on what kind of a need you're talking about. So if you're talking about, kind of a generic, good, high quality early care and education program, that's kind of one question. Another is a program for children who are living in poverty with exposure to violence. That's a different kind of program. And my expertise in all of the different programs around the country is very limited relative to my understanding of the science. So I wish I could give a better answer to that question, but I just don't know. And I would encourage you not to trust anybody who never says I don't know when you ask a question.
Appreciate it.
One of the things that I want you to touch on before we run out of time, and we may not get to all the questions, but it was one of the most compelling moments for me in your presentation that I heard last July, because oftentimes for providers, for those of us who are working on this from a foundation side, we often hear that there's kind of those children, and we condemn them to kind of repeat this cycle based on their parents, the environments they come from. But you have been a part of a study with mice that, or you know about the study with the mice that shows the effects of environment and nurturing. And I think it's a really important message for all of us who are involved in this work to know that there is hope and that the change can be in one generation.
You mean those mice?
Those mice, exactly.
So, oh God, there's so much to say about that. So let me just make a couple of quick comments. First, the studies that Stephanie is referring to were done by Michael Meany and his colleagues in Montreal, looking at the impact of different quality of nurturance of mother mice to baby mice. And there are kind of high quality nurturing mice and low quality nurturing mice, and they've been bred to kind of be two different. And so they're genetically different in terms of the high lickers and groomers and the low lickers and groomers. And their babies are genetically identical, and they are either nurtured well or not nurtured well, and they in turn nurture or don't nurture well their offspring. And a cross-fostering study was done where they took genetically high nurturing mice and had them raised by low nurturing genetic mice, and took genetically low nurturing raised. And the punchline of this is that the effect and the effect on stress response was determined by the quality of the nurturing, not by the genetics. And it actually changed the genetic, it had a change on the gene, not on the genes, but on the DNA, so that in the next generation, these mice parented the way they were parented, not the way their genetics were. But I can't, so getting down to the molecular level of how behavior affects gene expression, but I can't, maybe a good way to end is to say that this issue of other people's children is probably at the bottom of what is our biggest challenge. Now, I mean, one could talk about this just from a moral point of view about, how could we talk about children as other people's children and not all of our children? And there is this additional issue, which all of you are familiar with, of the fact that whether you care about other people's children or not, the quality of your children's life is affected by how other children do, and the quality of the society you live in is affected by how other people raise their children. It has to do with whether how much attention is distracted in school to who. I mean, the best way to leave it is, so every baby born today is going to share with every other baby born today, paying off this national debt, Social Security, Medicare, and God knows what else going into the future. So everybody who's not paying into that system is costing everybody else extra. Now, if the moral responsibility isn't enough, that goes on the table too. But the more important thing also is that other people, with very, 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 very few exceptions, other people who are not doing with their children what you would like to have do with your children are capable and wanting to do better with their children. They just need some help, as opposed to being demonized. And we all pay a huge price for the other people's children frame. It's a bad one.
So much of what you've heard this evening could be viewed as somewhat alarmist, because we often hear about the negatives that can occur without proper interaction and interventions. But there's a flip side to this as well, because what Jack's work has also shown, in the work of some of the other scientists, is that the proper interventions and relationships early can also change what we have viewed as intractable problems in society. So it gives us hope that if we all come together, we break down these silos, we can begin to make some real change for the children of Georgia. So thank you for being here with us this evening, and we so look forward to a continued relationship with you and with the state as well.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jack and Stephanie, for leading this extremely fascinating discussion. A special thanks to the organization that Stephanie founded, GEARS, the Georgia Early Education Alliance for Ready Students, and to its executive director, Mindy Binderman, who is here with us, for their leadership in Georgia on early childhood issues. And you can go to GEARS with 2 E's, GEEARS.org, to learn more about them. I invite all of you to join the Birth to 5 movement. As you've heard tonight, you will not find a better return on your time, your talent, and your investment. Please take a look at the list of many partners that the Blank Foundation has worked with and find out how you can work with any of them to personally make a difference in this issue. Jack, thank you again for joining us tonight.